Good afternoon, and thank you again for joining us today. My name is Patrick Gill, and I'm the Senior Director of Tax and Financial Policy at the Canadian Chamber. Joining me today are two Deloitte Canada representatives, Nick Galetto, partner with Deloitte, and also Fatima Laher, Global Lead Client Service Partner and Board Director. Nick and Fatima will discuss how you can address challenges and meet the varying needs of your stakeholders by leading with trust. Again, thank you very much for joining us today, and please enjoy the presentation. Over to you, Nick and Fatima.
Thank you, Patrick. And Fatima and I are delighted to be here with you today. And, trust has been front and center throughout this pandemic. It's something that we've lived with and built through relationships for decades, centuries. And it's something that continues to be extremely important to most organizations in how they evolve their business models. And one of the approaches that we'd like to discuss today is, reopening in terms of the pandemic, but equally important, what it means to business. And so today we'll try to take you through what we perceive to be a way of operationalizing trust and ensuring that trust is embedded in everything that you do. And no better way to do that than to start off perhaps with a video.
As we recover, reopen, and rebuild, it's time to rethink about the importance of trust. At no time has it been more tested or more valued in our leaders and each other. Trust can unite a nation, galvanize a purpose, combat uncertainty, and dispel future threats. In the ever-changing and ever-challenging world of business, trust is all-encompassing. Physical, emotional, digital, financial, and ethical. A true must-have. A value is now invaluable. Trust distinguishes and elevates your business. Put trust at the forefront of your planning, strategy, alliances, and purpose. Connect these elements and your customers, regulators, your board, and employees will put their trust in you. The trust advantage. Let Deloitte measure it and maximize it. Unlock the value of trust.
So for today, what we're planning to cover off are three key areas. One is, what is trust? I think we all have a pretty good understanding of what trust is, but why is it more relevant today than it ever was? Understanding trust, the broader sense of trust. We know, as I mentioned, how trust enables relationships, but what are some of the things that truly impact those relationships, both in the physical space, but also the digital space that we operate in today? And then, kind of float some trust dilemmas and get your interaction as part of this as well, and try to unpack, what are some of the issues that organizations are dealing with today, and what are some of the strategies that we can take to help mitigate some of those risks. So what is trust? As I said, it's more relevant today than at any time. And it is truly multidimensional. There's a human aspect to it that builds that strength in those relationships. But as we start moving into more of the digital space, understanding what are those interaction models? The interaction models from a people perspective, and how we built those relationships over time. There was a lot of give and take, and a lot of that was built on a foundation, and that foundation continued to grow. And today, as we kind of separate the human interaction in its traditional manner, what are some of the things that we should be looking for and adapting to ensure that people feel like they can trust you? They feel that they can trust an organization. What we see from a business perspective is that many organizations have a purpose statement. Many have stated that they want to put their purpose before profits. They want to focus on, broader shareholder value to include stakeholder value. And so in doing that, it's important for us to understand how those stakeholders are impacted and what's expected of those stakeholders. And it can't be a single dimension around customer, employee, or supplier. It needs to incorporate all key stakeholders. And I think it's important for us to also realize that in today's society, there's more expected from business. It's not just about the shareholder value, as I mentioned, and there's a responsibility to society that we bring and is expected by citizens globally. And so we've got to reshape the way we behave. So how do we reshape the way we behave? We have to look at it from the inside out. What we do within our organizations will reflect how our key stakeholders see us externally. And I think it's also important, to ensure that it's, the actions that we put forward, and we kind of refer to it in two dimensions. We often say that, it's important to have an intent, so your stated purpose as an example, but equally important is the competence behind it. So in other words, you're walking the talk. And so those shared values, the purpose that you drive within your organization has to be followed. It has to be believed for it to make an impact in society. So today, as I mentioned, it's front and center, and we see it in the news almost daily. And regardless of what industry sector you're in, there are issues around trust and integrity. And no more today than any other time are we seeing it through the pandemic. Misinformation is a big issue that we're dealing with. Around vaccinations and the vaccines themselves, we all come into question what's real, what's being fabricated, and are they being totally transparent? And they being, again, looking at it from a key stakeholder perspective, government, the manufacturers of those vaccines, healthcare workers in terms of more of the governance process, and ensuring that they're doing right by us. And the traditional drivers that we've seen in the past in terms of those relationships are now coming into question. So with that, we look at it from two perspectives. Obviously, there's huge benefits, if you get this right, but there's also huge implications if you don't. And if you take a look at, some of the research that we've done over the last 24 months, and we took a look at 3 organizations in particular, global organizations across industry sectors. So it was financial services, engineering, and automotive. What we looked at is organizations that did have a breach of trust, impacted integrity, and what the financial implications were for those organizations. And what we found was that for the majority, most, market cap fell between 20 and 56% when they were impacted by a breach of trust. And we measured that over a year to 3-year period. And in some cases, what we found that, it actually accelerated and it became, more and more pervasive in multi-jurisdictions if it had implications with regulators, as an example. The lack of trust, some of the research that we've done, with global brands impacted by 2.5 trillion per year. And then last but not least, if we took a look at those same organizations, those 3 that I talked about, and we measured them against their industry peers or the industry index, we saw a drop of 26 to 74%. Now, if we look at it from the flip side, if you're getting the trust process right within your organization, and some of the highly trusted brands, we saw that from some of our surveys that 88% have bought again. So if they feel comfortable with your organization and you're doing right by them, it increases obviously the stickiness with your brand. And in fact, 73% would have tried new products and services from that same brand. Stronger brand is also associated with performance. It's an obvious conclusion as well, but to quantify it, we saw that for trustworthy companies, it was 2.5 times greater than what they would have seen from their competitors. And last but not least, as it relates to employees, a key stakeholder, we found that companies with higher degree of trust experienced, employees experienced 74% less negative stress and 106% more energy at work. And productivity increased by 50%, and there was higher employee engagement as well. So the more satisfied an employee is, the less likely of burnout. And so when we look at trust, and again, looking at it from a broader industry perspective, and some of the C-suite organizations that we interviewed as we're starting to shape our thinking about trust and truly looking at it from a more end-to-end perspective, most organizations ask the question. So regardless of whether it was the CEO, CMO, CRO, et cetera, how do we measure and monitor trust was a big question. How do we actually operationalize trust? So how do we embed it in everything that we do? And as part of that measurement, be able to monitor it and adjust as we go. How could we be more proactive and less reactive? And some organizations would have said, well, we have NPS scores, we manage customer satisfaction, but that was one dimensional. It didn't include looking at also employee satisfaction as an example. How do we ensure that trust is actually driving competitive advantage? And it goes back to some of the measuring and monitoring. And then the biggest question we got was, who ultimately owns trust? And some of the conversations that we've had with CEOs, as an example, they were reflecting on, well, maybe it's the chief ethics officer, well, maybe it's the chief risk officer, well, maybe it's our chief product officer and services officer or marketing officer. Ultimately, we all have accountability to drive trust, regardless of where we sit and what we do. And ultimately, it rolls up to the CEO. And what we're seeing, the questions now coming as well is from a board perspective in terms of some of these exact questions. How do we know that we're building trust with our key stakeholders? How do we ensure that if there is a breach of trust, that we have mechanisms in place to correct and fix and get back on track with trust? And so let's take a look at unpacking trust, and I'll turn it over to Fatima, and she'll take you through the 4 dimensions of human trust.
Thank you, Nick. So what's important to note is trust is everywhere. And in the context of business, what's really the business challenge facing organizations? And when you just talk about trust and you think about it from a business perspective, the topic can be overwhelming because most organizations will believe that obviously we're an ethical organization, we're a trustworthy organization. But the question really is how have you really looked at it from your perspective and how do the stakeholders perceive you? Through the exercise of us developing the trust framework, the team at Deloitte worked exceptionally hard in ensuring that we didn't only have our own perspectives, but we really went and got information from consumers, from the market, from stakeholder interviews. And this is where this framework has actually landed. Why I love this framework, it actually gives all organizations, all decision makers, all directors, all executives, a lens in which to approach any of the business problems. So we talk about physical, emotional, digital, and financial. And what I will do is I will take you through an example of how this resonates when you in an organization is trying to assess how does trust impact you. In the context of physical, we don't have to labor the point about what we're all going through. Hopefully the worst of the pandemic is in our rearview mirror. But the physical safety of our employees became exceptionally important. That was not only across Canada, but it was across the world. What steps would an organization need to take to ensure the physical safety of an organization? Emotional is exceptionally important as well because it runs through every decision making that you do. Sometimes as an organization, you may stand for something that may not be consistent with what your internal stakeholders will view. And I will use an example like the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion. something an organization stands for. You may be in a situation where who you do business with, or how your recruitment processes actually are taking place, or what your board and your executive looks like. What sort of emotions is that conjuring up in the context of your stakeholders? Very, very important to note that. Digital trust, it goes without saying, in the context of COVID and the pandemic, moving to digital platforms literally happened at a click of the switch. And organizations that historically were reluctant to actually move to digital had to do this because they were forced to. But what did that actually bring in the context of trust? From a customer perspective, having employees work from home. From an employee perspective, buying online goods, giving your information to, having food delivered to your home, how your information is being used, online subscriptions, lots and lots of information that historically were being looked at was accelerated. But also this is one of the foundations of trust. And financial is also extremely important. There are many lenses you can look at it from, and I'll share two examples. Financial could be an example of looking at the financial health of an organization. And again, using the pandemic as an example, not only in Canada, but across the globe, governments leaned in the context of either bailouts or giving people incentives, should they need help. Certain industries have been decimated. They've been offering wage subsidies. They've been offering employees help. What you did find here was, although the governments and regulators allowed this to happen, it became a question of trust of whether you as an organization were ethically eligible to actually claim those subsidies. And I'm using that as an example. And the reason I say you've done nothing wrong, as an organization, you're probably within the laws and the rules of applying for the help that government is offering, which is absolutely there for you as an organization. But in the context of how stakeholders view this, there could be, a loss of trust from public perception. There's been lots of articles in the news. There isn't anything you don't open up where trust and business decisions and issues that you stand for is being questioned. Another example in the context of financial, and I always use this one, seeing that I'm a tax partner as well. As a tax professional, one of the goals always is about, minimizing, obviously legally with legal channels, minimizing a company's tax exposure. But if it means going offshore, aggressive tax planning, tax structures that could be viewed as probably a local jurisdiction as not getting its fair share, again, nothing wrong from a legislation perspective, but in the eyes of public opinion, in the eyes of a consumer, in the eyes of your employees, it could be viewed very differently. This framework is exceptionally helpful for you as leaders in business. Anytime you're being faced with a business problem, is to pause and reflect, take a step back and assess the decision that you're about to make from these lenses. We can go to the next slide. This slide really resonates with me, and Nick alluded to the context of who owns trust in an organization. And what we have found through our experience is that often enough when we ask the question, some people point to each other at the executive level, but it's not really definitive of who exactly owns it. But it is becoming a very topical issue. And what we've endeavored to do here was to break it down purely from a stakeholder perspective. So let's look at the board and shareholders. And from a board perspective, people may not be aware of this, but there's significant class action lawsuits that are coming against boards of directors. And the class action lawsuits are coming to boards of directors from the employees within the organization. And this is where employees would turn around and say that the board and the company's stated missions and visions are not aligned with its internal operations. You're seeing a lot of that happening. Recently in the US, thank God it still hasn't come to the courts, but a lot of technology companies have been faced with these class action lawsuits. So we just need to watch this space. In the context of customers now have a voice. And through the exercise that Deloitte had conducted, basically in terms of the surveys that we had done, customers, especially in Canada, 85% of the people, 85% of Canadians will sever their ties with an organization in a heartbeat if there's a perceived breach of trust. That tells you about the ethical compass of the population in Canada. The other thing that actually also came out through the study that we conducted, more than 50% of Canadians don't trust organizations. So it begs the question as to why. Employees as well is a significant stakeholder. We've given some examples, but Nick said it, and they always talk about organizations. If you really want to see the trust of an organization, interview the employees. Partners and vendors, again, what we're beginning to see is, and I'll use diversity, equity, and inclusion as an example. As organizations are partnering or they're contracting with vendors, they're asking for companies' stated diversity policies. So if companies are becoming more purpose-led and there are issues that are extremely important to them, that's exactly the areas they've got to focus on. The regulators, again, exceptionally important in the context of anything that you do, and or obviously, compliance with the law and legislation is extremely important. But sometimes compliance doesn't necessarily mean it actually checks the box in the context of how the broader stakeholders view it. And this is a classic example. You've heard of companies, mining companies that are legally allowed to mine in certain countries, but it could be viewed as mining on indigenous land. So from a legal perspective, a regulated perspective, everything's done by the book. But in the eyes of public perception, it actually views as not being, those companies are not trustworthy. And then the broader community. So these are extremely important stakeholders to consider anytime you in an organization are making a decision about anything, no matter whether it's big or small. It's not only anymore about profits. Over to you, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Fatima. So let's have a look at the trust dilemmas, and we can go to the next slide. And so, we'll take the employee lens here for a second, and want to hit on something that Fatima talked about, about it starting on the inside, and I had mentioned it in the opening. And if you can get your employees to trust in you as an organization, there's a higher probability that you're going to have success with all those stakeholders that Fatima just talked about. And if the employees trust you, there's more incentive for them to outperform and increase, productivity, as we talked about. So let's take a look at, how we look at reopening as an example. So most of you are probably going through it as we speak, and probably started months earlier, where you're starting to plan. It may not be a full reopening, but you're starting to look at ways to start letting employees back into the office. And, some of the things that you're probably contemplating is, do employees actually want to return? Do they feel safe to return? Is it because of, could be multiple things, but is it because they still feel that society as a whole hasn't done enough to ensure their protection and their safety? Or is it because they're worried about the office space? Is there issues in terms of how they're going to interact with their colleagues and other stakeholders as well in the physical space? And taking a look at it from the standpoint of, how do we ease in and ensure that we're starting to rebuild that trust, for employees to come in. And what we often say is that using the 4 dimensions of trust, which Fatima mentioned how much she loves, and we all echo that, it gives us the opportunity to look at it through a stakeholder lens. And in this case, let's say it's the employees, and truly try to understand, so what's the resistance and what's the opportunity? And using that as a lens will help us at least make the right decisions. They may not be the perfect decisions, but at least make the right decisions. So with that, what we'd like to do is run this polling question and get your perspective on things. So there's two questions here on the screen. As you contemplate your return to work, do you trust or distrust your employer to create a safe return to work experience? Highly distrust, trust, and highly trust.
Nick, it's probably worth sharing some examples about this. Is not unique to Canada, but this is a dilemma that a lot of organizations globally are contemplating, and everybody's looking, right, to each other to see how employees are reacting. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think the other aspect here too is that there are some lessons learned from kind of the waves that we've gone through and taking a look at other jurisdictions, and in particular with Asia Pac, right? And the first wave, we saw that there was a lot more trust, let's say, that they were going to do the right things by ensuring that there was a social distancing, or communicating about sanitizing environments. And so there was some people that were going back to work. What we saw was, as the second wave started to be introduced again, people were less now inclined to feel that it was safe enough, or that there was enough trust put into those organizations. And I think the conclusion from like that second wave was transparency and ensuring that you're communicating both the good and the bad, right? And
True.
not just pushing for the good.
Well said. Do we have the result that's come in?
We do. 4% distrust, 51% trust, and 44% highly trust.
Thank you for that.
Very good. I guess if we looked at to unpack that, one of the conclusions, and I think I kind of touched on it, it was the over communicate and ensure that people know what you're doing, how you're doing that, and reporting back to them.
Can we go to the next? That's very encouraging to see that there's a higher degree of trust within the organizations. So that's actually quite trending in the right direction.
Next question. Should you choose to return to work, do you trust or distrust your co-workers to social distance and similar scale? We'll give it a few seconds for everyone to respond.
This is interesting, Nick. I think we've seen organizations that have introduced the concept of pulse surveys, which they're doing literally on a bi-weekly basis. So that's how you get employees to sort of be part of the decision making. And my understanding is that has been viewed very favorably by employees within the organizations. Exactly. I'm not sure if
yeah, it would be good. Too bad it's unfortunate it can't be more interactive with this team to get their perspectives on some of the things that they're doing. But from some of the clients that we've talked to, Fatima, we do see that they run these regular surveys, whether it's monthly or quarterly or timely, depending on when they're looking to reopen or to let employees back into the office.
That's true. Can we see the results of the survey? Let's just pull them up. So 28% distrust.
Yeah. Interesting. So again, some of the feedback may not reflect what's here, but typically what we see is that it's the individuals that are less trusted than the organization. So in terms of sanitization or trying to enforce social distancing, organizations are actually putting policies in place and then enforcing them. But then it becomes the employee, obligation to ensure that they're actually living that, and that's where I think people are more concerned that that will not take place.
Yeah, the one big thing that we're hearing from a lot of our global colleagues is this whole concept of civil liberties being, people are bridging that, and it will be interesting case studies to see what happens going forward. Another stat was, at the beginning of the pandemic, 1 in 10 employees turned around and said that they wanted to work remotely all the time. And as we actually graduated through the pandemic, that changed. And now you find 7 in 10 employers turns around and says they would really want to be, they would want to work indefinitely remotely unless there are strict protocols in place regarding, safety, employee safety.
Thank you for that. So what are, again, some of the things that we're hearing, what do employees miss? Not surprising at all. Being able to interact with their colleagues, seeing people, catching up with people in the physical space. We do it through Zoom and calls, but that we all have this Zoom fatigue. Comfort that, we've become more savvy in terms of technology at home. I know that, I'm a cyber partner, and I used to just work off my laptop. Now I've got 3 monitors going on, which is very helpful in terms of navigating my day-to-day. Control, focus better when in the office and get my job done without interruptions. I find that, similar to some of you as well, like meetings pop up regularly, you're back to back, where, you kind of miss going into the office and being able to talk to a colleague, spend 5 minutes and move on, rather than setting up a 30-minute meeting as an example. And, from a commute perspective, we hear, don't necessarily miss the commute, the long commute, but we do miss the fact that we're able to walk around the office, walk to the office, get some fresh air, and just break the monotony of every day. And so, some of the relief or concern in returning to work, and I think we're getting better at this, but at the beginning, we kind of sanitized everything and we're worried about what we can touch. I think it's equally important today, as we've learned more, but we're all still very concerned of what can we touch, what can't we touch. Transportation, if it's public transit, ensuring that it's sanitized, ensuring that we're doing all the right things in terms of social distancing, wearing masks, as an example. Elevators are still an issue. I experienced going back to, well, I guess it's any environment where there's a limit of 3, and then the elevator opens and someone just ends up popping in, and you kind of get all freaked out about it. So there's still those concerns, and people still not obeying some of those rules. And the other thing too, I think is important is, if you have elderly parents or grandparents that you're taking care of, or those that may be sick, you're worried about taking the disease home, and so less reluctant to be open in moving about. And then I mentioned trust around social distancing, because not all of us are careful as we should be. And I'm sure you've experienced it. I've experienced it in grocery stores as well, where people are kind of in your space and you're a bit paranoid, which wasn't the case in the past. And some actually like working from home and would like to have the balance of going into the office and feel that productivity has increased from work from home. So, as we start to apply kind of the 4 dimensions of human trust that Fatima had walked us through, and she gave some very, very good examples. So again, intent, ensuring that what we say we're actually acting on. So that's the competence piece, making sure that yin and yang are clearly understood and reflected in everything that you do. And then taking the 4 dimensions and truly looking at it from both an opportunity as well as an implication perspective as you're making the decisions, like on the enhanced sanitation, making sure that it's in accordance with guidelines or whatever health policies are set, and conveying that to employees as well, so that they know, like, this station's been sanitized, at this time, et cetera, or washrooms, et cetera. The face coverings, wearing of masks, ensuring that is enforced, and that if the people feel comfortable enough to call that out, and so ensuring that they truly understand that this is a given, this is not an option, right? And then also, are there certain things that you can accommodate in terms of to address the public transportation? I haven't thought through this in great detail, but some organizations that we've talked to have talked about potentially even carpooling, small groups, right? 1 or 2 people, Some have talked about other means to be able to accommodate individuals from coming to work, which is riding a bike or other means, for example. Emotional part, I think, is equally important and probably most important to ensure that you understand, like through some of those surveys that Fatima talked about, that you understand where their concerns are, take that feedback, put together a plan, and ensure that you're communicating that plan, and making sure that there's transparency in it as well. So, like, again, if you're saying you're going to do it, make sure that you do it. Encourage employees to provide feedback. So if they see that things aren't working, they're not going to get penalized for it, and that your organization is actually going to listen. Elevate some of the fears with regards to job insecurity. Some of the things that we've heard is, I think, if I don't go back to the office, and I work from home, those going back to the office are going to get preferential treatment, or they're going to be respected and given the opportunities to grow within the organization, which often isn't true, but making sure that that is clearly communicated. And then also, I think from a digital perspective, some of the things that we've heard recently would be things such as, our employers are implementing monitoring solutions. And, as employers, we need to make sure that we tell them why we're doing it, right? It isn't to spy on them. It isn't to collect, private information. It's one, to protect the environment, from, as Fatima talked about, this digital space now where we need to protect data and make sure that data is used ethically, the cybersecurity considerations as well, ensuring that we have a better way of working in both the physical and digital space. Some folks are going to work from home. We need to ensure that those that are in, for example, a boardroom or a meeting room can pull those folks in as well. So I think those are things that we need to think through as we look at the digital space. And then from a financial perspective, making sure that compensation models are fair. So again, you don't get penalized if you're working from home and not the office, and ensuring that we're also considerate of additional expenses that our employees are incurring. So it may not necessarily be related to the transportation part that they paid themselves, but there are probably some things that they need from an ergonomic perspective for home that we should help them fund, and go a long way to enabling that trust. So we'll move to the next polling question. So here, which of the 4 human dimensions of trust should organizations bear in mind when devising their return to work strategy? And this would be a multiple choice. And Fatima, anything else to add as I kind of covered off those 4 dimensions?
No, I think there's a lot. Like, I mean, every aspect of what we do, whether it's in business, whether it's in choices we make, whether we go to a restaurant, you got to think about the impact of trust. And Nick, the one other thing, what has happened, we touched on it, but just impact of social media and the digital platforms has exacerbated the whole impact of how people show up. And literally at a nasty tweet, an inadvertent comment, just even something as recently that I read was a 17-year-old individual's comments, when a person's a teenager, haunting them as an adult. So all these things in terms of digital and what it means, there's a lot to unpack here. But I do believe the framework that we've got, if people think of it through this lens, it actually does give you a reason to pause and keeps you grounded.
Yes. Let's have a look at the results. Well, from my perspective, not surprising. As I said in the opening, making sure that we take a look at all 4 dimensions of trust. Not surprising that emotional is 85%. We're humans. Trust is built on human interaction, for sure.
Yeah, it takes a long time to build, but it just gets destroyed in a nanosecond.
If we poll the next question. And here it's which of these actions has the highest ability to ensure that it's a successful return to work. We'll give it a few seconds here.
Yeah, this is interesting for me. And I think we talk a lot about, rules and regulations, and we're all seeing that under the pandemic. How I personally view this, everyone is unique and everybody has their own individual risk tolerance. And you often find some people are absolute rule. They will be and obey the rules, and then you get others that will maybe not and be a little bit in their mind more practical, and will then tend to rationalize. But no one person reacts to situations the same way, which makes the whole concept of the return to work. We spoke about co-workers, our employees, is not exactly easy.
Great, we can see the results. Yeah, not surprising, clear and transparent communications. I would have thought that would be top of mind. Great, perfect.
Yeah. That hits on the concept of transparency, right? People ask for transparency. This is an interesting one. When remote work becomes taxing, the word taxing, what we've noticed through the pandemic, and this is not only at the pandemic, with the rise of the digital age, more and more requests for employees of organizations is to wanting to work remotely. And at first, when you just think about it, it seems like a no-brainer. But organizations have not really been prepared for people to work remotely, consistently, and also within not only within the provinces, but within the borders of Canada. And then what happens if you get the request of people wanting to work outside of Canada? When you get employed employed in an organization, it's a very traditional way of you showing up, what the expectations are, companies' policies, and now you're beginning to see a significant change from what employees are asking. Often enough, I've often used this word. It's not that companies won't do certain things, allow certain things, they just can't. And the reason I emphasize the words they can't do it, it's because regulations and laws haven't kept up with the digital era. It hasn't. And even though, we see so much of the fast exponential pace of technology, again, governments within Canada, outside of Canada, have not kept up to date with that. We saw that just in Canada with the home office expenses and what you could and couldn't claim. It took a lot of work. I'm proud that Canada did come up with something, but it wasn't exactly easy because it warrants lots and lots of administration, sign-offs from various regulators, different levels of government. Employees have an expectation. Employers have an expectation, and they also have rules. And then you've got the role of regulators. I've said it before, in the context of just the digital age, hopefully with a lot of, the rise of consumer activism, employee activism, just society as a whole, advocating for a little bit more 21st century rules, things can change, but it doesn't happen overnight. And even though we may get more pragmatic from a Canadian perspective, we also have to think about being part of a global village, and it doesn't really work. What we've heard through all the clients and, just anecdotally what we've been seeing is that there's a bit of a disconnect between what employees think they're entitled to with what employers can deliver. And a classic example of that is basically somebody has a condo in Miami and, they always go and they're saying, what's wrong? It's COVID. I actually would like to work from Miami. Right? What are the consequences? And people automatically think it may just be a tax issue. It's not only tax, the other consequences. You've got to think about immigration. You've got to think about labor laws. You've got to think there's so many things that organizations have to grapple with that a lot of these issues cannot be addressed in literally overnight or just at a request of somebody asking. My comment about the regulators again is that right now with everything that we're seeing, across the globe, this is not unique to Canada, legislation around employees working remotely has not kept pace with the advancements in technology. Has not. So this is something really to be aware of. And then from an employee perspective, employees turn around and perceive an organization not to be fair, right? There's a lot of asks and sort of not being able to digest the whole concept of what you can do versus what you cannot do. So I hope you find that interesting, but to the extent that you've got any questions, don't ever hesitate to reach out to me in this particular area. So let's do this, the next polling question. And the first question is, do you think it is appropriate for organizations to monitor all their employees and devices to preempt a scenario where they will have to pay additional taxes because of the location where the employees choose to work from? It's a yes or no. I'll be really interested to see this. Some color commentary on this is that often enough, most of the technology that you use, your cell phone, your laptop, in most cases, it probably would be company-owned assets. And it comes up a lot in the context of what is allowed by an employer. And Nick alluded to the whole, monitoring. These are things that you really have to look at. We're going to have to go back to people's employment contracts. Legal counsel needs to get involved. But it's, again, trust and transparency. If people don't know what is being used and how they're being monitored, I think that basically breaks trust. Let's look at the result. And Nick, I'd love you to respond to that. Wow. Well, 58% says no.
Yeah.
Nick, what's your thoughts here?
Yeah, there's two aspects to this. So again, taking the cybersecurity view on this, it's important for us to know where, regardless of which stakeholder is logging in, where they're logging in from, to make sure that it's legitimate, right? And so organizations do track that based on the fact that through geolocation, user ID and password, right? And so so that is a legitimate reason. I think it comes back to the other polling questions around transparency. It's just making sure that employees understand what the purpose is of why you're doing something, right? And if you are going to do it for those reasons that we've highlighted here, then you have to be clear that you're going to be doing that, right? And ensure that employees are aware.
Yeah, and also just in the context of companies' current internal policies or travel policies, if you don't have a policy around remote work, it's something you want to contemplate, and it's very, very important for employees to understand this. What we're also seeing is employees basically pitching an argument, and I think it's with merit, but I'll tell you what from an employee perspective what they're saying. We're embracing a technology age. We need to be modern in our thinking. What is wrong with me working if I'm employed in Canada, but I've got a family in India, ailing parent, and I can still do my job? Why are you saying I cannot work remotely? So these things are becoming extremely topical, and where the employee can actually change the perspective, they can view that as basically saying, you know what, you're not treating me fairly. And that's why I say clarity around policies, especially in this area, is going to become exceptionally crucial going forward. Because again, I said, we would have thought the pandemic would have given organizations or given regulators a chance to reset some of these rules, which tax rules haven't been updated in decades. It hasn't. It's become more punitive, and you're actually finding, most countries around the globe are seeing non-compliance with corporations as a cash grab. We can do the next polling question. I think I hinted on this. Do you think some of the tax laws need to be revisited to accommodate the new normal? Yes or no? I'm hoping we have a unanimous answer here, but anyway, interested to see what the audience thinks. Nick, what's your thought?
Yeah, some of the implications that you talked about, I'm sure are not that simple, but we need to think through what is the art of the possible going forward, because I think the world is going to change, and we may be going back to some resemblance of what it was before, but nowhere near the kind of the physical space that we lived in, especially now, to your point, Fatima, where most organizations kind of turned on a dime to become digitally enabled, right? And that isn't going to change.
I had to chuckle when I saw an article in the papers yesterday in the Globe and Mail where they spoke about, being able to claim your meals at home as a tax deduction. So certain restaurants were becoming quite creative with their menus and having it labeled almost the names of the menu items were like after stationery. And I think you can turn around and think, is that a company that's innovative, or is that really basically just an issue around trying to get around certain complex tax rules? My vote would be from a trust perspective and transparency. Let's work with government to relax some of the rules. Can we see the results? Hey.
Not surprising.
Not surprising. Thank you for that.
Got about 8 minutes. Happy to take questions.
Perfect. Fatima, Nick, thank you so much for the informative presentation. Everyone still on the line, this is your opportunity to ask a question of Nick and Fatima. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Trust us with your questions. While you're thinking about those, I think I have one. Just to kick off the conversation. So I can imagine that communications and transparency correlates greatly with trust. How much is too much transparency or communications that is required for an organization to use?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. My view on this is that be as transparent as possible. People will read through it. Like if there's confidentiality issues associated with whatever that situation may be, then you have to respect that. If there's certain disclosures that you can't provide, then you got to respect that. But other than that, what you stand for, you have to be very clear and transparent in delivering that message, would be my view. I don't know what you think, Fatima.
I do think it's really a very topical question. It's really, again, I'm going to go back to our framework. Anytime you have a problem statement or something happens, it's very important to think about it through the lens of the stakeholders. Nick raised an important point. Sometimes organizations want to share something transparently, but they cannot because of legal issues, right? But there's also work around that. Very, very important to have communication strategies in place. Some organizations have things like a rapid fire response team. So it's as long as the information is landing in the right place with all stakeholders' interest taken into account. So then whatever decision a company has made, they've done it thoughtfully and deliberately. And then whatever happens, they prepared for the consequences. I would highly, highly recommend that. Like, that's why you can see I'm a huge fan of our framework.
Great, thank you. Now turning to the questions here, we have one from Kaylee. How do you rebuild inner cross-functional trust?
Okay, I'll start. I'll attempt to answer that question. Rebuilding trust, as we said, is exceptionally difficult, but it can be done. It's never ever a situation of all doom and gloom. It really does have to go back. I spoke about the risk profiles of stakeholders, the risk profiles of the people. Depending on the problem, you're talking about, interconnectivity, you're talking about cross-function. You got to understand where individuals and their thought processes are. Again, you're going to ask the question, you're going to get the feedback, and then you're going to respond. As long as people are brought along the journey, that's how you start building trust. But when things are imposed, with no transparency and no consultation, is when trust is broken. Nick, your perspectives will be.
Yeah, another key quote that I like is, "Don't tell me, show me." Right? So it's great that you use words and tell me all these things, but show me. That's how you start to rebuild that trust.
And tone from the top. It goes without saying what we're seeing, and I keep talking about the media, but I do want to stress this point because depending who you are in the organization, or anybody embracing any of the digital platforms, there's always excellent opportunities. And I'm a huge fan of the digital platforms, but it also comes with an element of risk. And the risk I talk about is what you say, your actions and your words matter. You got to be careful about how it's actually going to land. So whenever you're about to do something, think about the stakeholders. If you're in a senior leadership position in an organization, before you do anything, try and think about the consequences of what you have to do. I don't have to mention situations. You can't open up a newspaper or listen to the news with trust being broken or a perceived break in trust, whether it's taking a vaccine in another country or whether it's jumping a queue or people suffering from vaccine envy, or it could be a situation of not responding quick enough to a perceived harassment case. There's so much that's happening, and the speed of which things make it to print media is really, it happens at instantly. So it's not like we are living like 20 or 30 years ago. It's very, very instant, and we all know this. We all have young kids with us at home, and the things that we learn from them as well is exceptionally insightful. But again, it's not without risk.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll ask one more question to give folks an opportunity to submit maybe one more question. So maybe looking at sort of another case study, looking at the public implications for public health decision makers around public trust around different vaccine options. Do you have any, for you, what should be the top issues that public health leaders should be considering to make sure that trust remains high across the board?
Yeah, I can take a first crack at that. So a couple of things that come to mind. We've seen over, in fact, like at the beginning of COVID, we saw a lot of trust in government, at least here in Canada. I'm not going to talk about some of the other jurisdictions. But what you started to quickly see, it started to fade. Why did it fade? It was because things were starting to get hidden. And what we're seeing now with vaccines, it's becoming more of a political game. So you don't really know what the truth is. The only thing that we can rely on is truth from science, right? And so let's listen to what the scientists have to tell us and not necessarily what the politicians have to tell us. I know that's a very strong statement, but when in doubt, go with the facts.
Yeah, I think I will just add the commentary, when in doubt, go with the facts. It also depends, because sometimes not everyone has a lens in which they view a situation. And often enough, that lens, we each have it. It comes with our own personal biases. So we don't have all the facts. And sometimes we're all very quick to rush to a judgment. It's extremely important to keep that in check.
Okay, well, we are quickly running out of time. And so, Nick and Fatima, I want to thank you very much again for your informative presentation, and a big thanks to Deloitte Canada for being so generous for hosting this webinar today and making it possible. I thank everyone for joining us for this conversation. If you have any additional questions regarding this presentation, we encourage you to reach out and contact Nick and Fatima. Thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day.